Trained Tiger Hampton.
Thank you so much. Dr. Oyen, can you hear us again?
I can hear you A-okay.
Okay, great. I think where we ended up was you were talking about the significance of a person having all 10 ACEs. I'm not sure if you finished your answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think just to make sure that we're all in the same context, I might just make sure that I'm kind of reiterating where we were at, which
Yes.
was thinking about those adverse childhood experiences. Again, those are things in the areas of abuse, neglect, household challenges that are linked to poor health outcomes and poor outcomes later in life. And again, just to highlight those 10 are abuse, so physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, physical neglect and emotional neglect, and then those household challenges like mental illness, intimate partner violence, parental separation or divorce, incarceration, or substance misuse or misuse or dependence on substances. And I think the biggest thing that we wanted to first highlight was that it is extremely rare to have all 10 adverse childhood experiences happen to you in your life. And so the biggest connection we wanted to make is that that does cause some increased risk. The other place that I wanted to reiterate was thinking about that connection between experiences and adolescent brain development, and making sure that we acknowledge that all adolescents, when they're making decisions, are operating with more of a social emotional system, or what I like to call the emotional brain. And when you have increased adverse childhood experiences, what can happen is that you have an even higher risk of something called hyperarousal, meaning that you're pretty easily triggered. And that can mean that your emotional brain is even having a bigger impact on your ability to make decisions. So I think that's where we left.
Thank you. What is the impact of having trauma or these experiences of trauma on adolescent brain development?
So trauma itself, again, I want to highlight the differences between trauma and ACEs. Trauma is really those significantly negative events, whether you witness them personally or you see them later. And ACEs are the specific adverse childhood experiences. So you can have trauma at any time in your life. However, adverse childhood experiences are those experiences that someone has before the age of 18, and they have specifically identified those 10 as being particularly adverse of. And so I do want to talk generally about trauma on brain development. And so again, knowing that adverse childhood experiences includes trauma. And when it comes to trauma on brain development, there's a few things that can happen on your brain development. What happens is that when you experience trauma, any of us, what happens is that we have an onslaught of neurotransmitters that come into our brain, and they try to help us cope. And what that does is that it tries to help us cope with that stress. And if you do not have a retreat or a safe environment, then what can happen is that your brain is in this constant state of hyperarousal, and it is constantly filled with those neurotransmitters. And so what can that do as an outcome? It can cause reduced feelings of pain, and it also can cause someone to be in that constant state of fear. And you can be pretty easily triggered by fear. An example that I'd like to give you, and actually it was something that I heard on the radio the other day, but it was somebody who came back from war, and they were talking about their experiences over in Iraq, and they talked about how even when they came back here to South Dakota, it was so hard to hear fireworks, because just hearing the firework made them feel like they were back into a combat zone, and was triggering all these fear responses, even though there was no fear there, right? We were just having fireworks. I think it's just really important to understand that for a child that experiences a lot of trauma, it's pretty easy to activate that fear center, pretty easy to feel like you're under threat, even when there is no threat present.
Are there particular parts of the brain that are more greatly affected by trauma?
Yeah, there are kind of like three three main parts that are pretty significantly impacted, and we have talked a little bit about them already. So the amygdala is the biggest one. The amygdala is that fear center. We talked about how in a typical person, it's the size of an almond. For someone that's experienced trauma, because it's used quite a bit, it actually gets bigger. It's like any, like about your muscles, right? If you use them a lot, they get bigger and stronger. The amygdala actually becomes sometimes even double in size. And what does that mean? That means that it is how we process fear. And so the amygdala becomes overactive. It can increase that levels of anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares. The other thing is that can be impacted is your hippocampus. So your hippocampus is in charge of memory consolidation, and trauma can damage the hippocampus, making it difficult to form and retrieve memories. I do want you to know that it's particularly impacted by memories related to a trauma event. And so, when they do these studies, they oftentimes have you do kind of memory tasks that are neutral memory tasks, and then they will also talk about, typically these studies are done through the therapeutic settings, and then when they are talking about like the memories related to a trauma event, those can be impacted. Then having things like poor memory, really struggling to retrieve memory information. Prefrontal cortex. So this one has, we have a lot of information about this today. Remember, prefrontal cortex is our decision maker, our ability to think about things from start to finish. The other thing is that we oftentimes associate that with executive functioning. Executive functioning really could be called self-regulation in many ways. So if you have an impairment in executive functioning, sometimes they would say that you have an impairment in self-regulation skills. And so what does that mean? That means that you have a hard time concentrating, making rational decisions. And the other thing that's so important is that it's about struggles with regulating emotions. One of the key researchers in things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they noticed that many kids that struggle with that particular disorder are also struggling with regulating emotions, and they think it's to do with that prefrontal cortex deficit, again, related to that decision making. And then the final thing, which has a little bit less to do, but it's still important, is that anterior cervical cortex, and that's more about attention, like where you focus your attention, emotional regulation, and then pain. And why do I bring that up? Because sometimes people that have had significant amounts of trauma actually don't interpret pain the same way that the rest of us do. And truly what that can mean is that, again, there could be this dysregulation. It actually can mean that you're more sensitive to pain, or then you have less sensitivity to pain. It's like you're in the extremes. And again, it also can lead to those kind of, health problems too in the long term, like chronic pain. So those are kind of the big areas that were impacted by trauma on the brain.
Can you talk a little bit about the fight, freeze, or flight idea?
Yeah. So when we call it in literature, it's really FFF, fight, flight, freeze. And the idea is that when you are, any of us, are in a situation that our brain is interpreting as stressful, there are 3 separate responses that we do. I do wish that we could control which one we activate. Unfortunately, it automatically activates. And fight is truly I'm fighting back. And flight would be, I'm fleeing away from the negative stimuli, I'm getting away from this. And then freeze is really like you just freeze up and you don't move. Things that happen in freeze is often decreased blood pressure, body temperature, and muscle tone. And part of that is because your body is trying to protect itself. And so, having these in a little bit of time is actually not so terrible. And what's interesting about stress on the brain is that we all need some levels of stress. Oh, sorry, my computer just did something.
Yeah, we just lost you. We kept hearing you.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Okay.
No problem.
Hear me
We
now?
kept hearing you, but we lost it. Now you're frozen. But
Oh, no. Okay, let me try
Okay.
to start my video and start it again. I've never had that happen before. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Technology's so fun for all of us today.
Yes.
Right, right. Okay, can everybody hear me and see me okay right now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, now I had a stress response, okay? So I'm gonna tell you right now what happened to my brain, right? I went to fight, flight, or freeze even in that real time. So then my own cognition went down into survival mode, trying to get that computer back on. So can you just say the question to me one more time, please?
Sure. So you were talking about the FFF, or fight, freeze, flight. And I don't know if you were finished or not when it went out, but.
Okay, thank you. It'd be almost comical if that happened during that time. But again, the biggest takeaway here is that it is a survival mechanism, and all of us use it. And the stress literature says that it is good for us to have some levels of stress, as long as you have breaks in between. And so, why is fight, flight, or freeze relevant in trauma research and in the impact of trauma on the brain? Is that when you don't get that break, that kind of reset to normal, then what happens is that hyperarousal or that really stressed out brain tends to be the common, and you tend to over respond because you've had all of these things. Like, you've had to live in an environment where you're constantly on the lookout for negativity, and so because of that, it can cause you more quickly to be able to go into fight, flight, or freeze.
And then what is the connection between trauma, as you've spoken about, and the decision-making process for adolescents?
Yeah, I think that in particular, this idea of impulse control deficits, or trying to struggle with that piece of regulation, we just know that especially children that have experienced a lot of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, it can be really challenging for someone to be able to maintain control because you have that impacted prefrontal cortex. Again, it tends to be, especially if you've had these experiences between the ages of 0 and 5, you're more quickly able to go to those spaces where you are dysregulated. And a dysregulated, stressed out brain doesn't tend to make the best decisions. And it tends to be that you might overreact to something that's fairly neutral, or you might tend to not only overreact to something neutral, but even if it is something quite, or maybe negative, you tend to extremely overreact to those kinds of things.
And then sort of finally on that topic, what is the impact of a person having these ACEs on their life expectancy?
This is a real emerging area of literature, but some estimates say that those who have high ACEs scores, meaning that you have 6 or more, may die nearly 20 years earlier than those with no ACEs. Again, these are risk kind of scores, and so I do want to highlight that the fact that you have an adverse childhood experience doesn't automatically mean all these poor things are going to happen to you. But when you have so many, and you have so many for so long, the likelihood of you having poor outcomes is higher, and then it can shorten your life.
What would you say is the impact of sort of trauma on criminal behavior in people?
So when we look at the literature about, in particular, some of the poor behavioral outcomes for those that are experiencing trauma, generally speaking, what can happen in how it relates to criminal behavior is that if you are struggling with things like your ability to regulate your emotions, if you are struggling with misinterpreting social cues from other people, those are the kinds of things that can kind of lead to more of those criminal types of behaviors. And so if you have some delinquency, or you're struggling with your mental health, if you struggle with attention problems like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, what can happen is that over time, you do get more and more rejected by your peers and those kinds of things. And what can lead to that is you can have some of those antisocial behaviors or disassociation. Again, you are often as likely to be a perpetrator as you are to be the victim. So do kind of know that too. And when it comes to that criminal behavior, I learned a lot from Kathy Whittam on this. And one of the things that she talks a lot about is that there's this cycle of violence. And again, why do you have more of a risk for becoming a perpetrator? Because you were a victim of violence and you've seen it. And that can increase your likelihood to, you've been modeled that, so you can also then repeat those kinds of things. Again, specific citations is that child maltreatment, as it relates to criminal behavior, has been found to increase the risk of later criminal behavior by 50%.
Can a brain that has sort of dealt with ACEs or this much trauma be repaired?
The biggest word here that I want us to all hear, everyone that can hear me in this courtroom, is the idea of neuroplasticity. So what is brilliant about our brains is that we can have a lot of things happen to us. We also can do a lot of rewiring. And neuroplasticity means that we can change pathways in our brains. There are certain times in your life where it is not easier, but your brain is still in development. So remember we talked about that prefrontal cortex and how there are some researchers that like to fight about this, but anywhere between the ages of 27 and 30 is where they say that prefrontal cortex has been fully developed. And so in particular, interventions that are done in that child to adolescent lifespan can really move the neuroplasticity or move pathways in the brain. Now that can only really be done if you are in a safe place, you feel safe, you're getting your basic personal needs met, and you're with those kinds of therapeutic interventions that have been proven to be effective. So do I think that we are always, as an expert here, do I think you're always impacted by the things that have happened to you? I think that it's difficult to forget terrible things that have happened to you. But do I think that there's a way that you can use what has happened to you to create new neural pathways, to remind yourself that you are safe, to find better ways to cope when you're overwhelmed by the stress that is happening in your life? Yes, I do.
Can I just have one moment, Your Honor?
Of course.
Just 1 second, Dr. Oyen. I don't have any further questions for you, Dr. Oyen, but the state may have a few.
Thank you, Attorney Hinckley.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, Doctor, the testimony that you gave this morning and just gave, those were to matters that were contained in a report that you prepared for the defense in this case, right?
They were contained within the report. And then also, I did a follow-up to the state on 731. And so they were both within those two areas, yes.
And the contents of your report are in general and not specific to this or any other case or offender, correct?
Correct.
What you discussed in your report is not directly related to this particular defendant, right?
Correct.
And you have no professional opinions either specific to this defendant or specific to this case, right?
My opinions are based on the literature, and I did make sure as I was doing this expert witness preparation, I now do know more about the case, but at the time in which I prepared the report and at the time in which I did my testimony prior, I did not know all of the specifics of the case, and I am not the psychologist of this defendant.
You've testified that adverse childhood experiences can lead to poor outcomes later in life, right?
Correct.
And poor outcomes is a term used by yourself and others in your field to describe poor behavioral or health events that are unexpected later in life, right?
Correct.
And you cannot predict behavioral or rehabilitative future for any particular juvenile offender, correct?
You cannot, say it one more time.
You cannot predict behavioral or rehabilitative future for any particular juvenile offender.
The literature says that there are evidence-based interventions that have been shown to be effective for those that have experienced trauma, but I cannot predict an individual's response to that evidence-based intervention.
You are aware of a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and poor behavioral outcomes later in life, right?
Correct.
The more adverse childhood experiences one has had, the more likely it is that the person will have poor outcomes later in life, correct?
Correct. It increases your risk.
And for someone who has had numerous adverse childhood experiences, it is very, very likely that he will have poor outcomes in adulthood, later in life.
The risk increases as the numbers of adverse childhood.
And if you recall your sworn deposition, your own terms were very, very likely have poor outcomes in adulthood.
Correct.
For example, far more likely to be quickly aggressive and far more likely to have quick triggers, correct?
Correct.
And a high degree of likelihood to have more highly aggressive behaviors, correct?
Correct.
And an incapacity to make good decisions, correct?
I would not say incapacity. I would use the word diminish.
So let's go to your sworn deposition, and you have that in front of you, right?
Yeah, let me pull it up. I did pull it up. Yes, I do right now.
Council, pages 57 and 58. And doctor, if you're there, let's start the bottom of page 57.
Second, 57.
So doctor, for the record, we can't talk over one another. I'll tell you the page reference again. I'm looking at your deposition, the bottom of page 57 and the top of page 58. And correct me if I'm wrong as to your sworn statement at the bottom of page 57. For some kids, it will make them incapable of making good decisions. Did I get that right?
Correct. And for some kids.
So,
but
again,
and then just to read, go ahead.
So doctor, that I got your testimony correct, right? Your terminology.
Correct. But you didn't read the rest of the sentence, and for some it does not, so it depends on the individual.
An incapacity to make good decisions, correct?
For some kids, it will make them incapable of making good decisions. For some, it does not, so it depends on the individual.
And you cannot distinguish between those who had adverse childhood experiences and will be incapable of making good decisions and those who may be capable of doing so, correct?
Without spending time with the individual to show those factors that might be at play, it would be difficult to be able to tell which people would make the decisions and which did not.
So the answer would be
And then-
yes to my question?
Can you say the question again? I want to make sure that I'm answering it in the way that I would like the court to be reflected.
You cannot distinguish between those who had adverse childhood experiences and will be incapable of making good decisions and those who may be capable of doing so.
Correct.
Also, among the poor behavioral outcomes that can result in adulthood from adverse childhood experiences are fighting, antisocial behavior, disassociation, and victimization, right?
Correct.
And victimization meaning that the person victimizes others, correct?
Correct.
And antisocial behavior that can result in adulthood from adverse childhood experiences involves misconduct that is disruptive and hostile and harmful to others and to society, correct?
That is the definition of those things, correct.
And such antisocial behaviors can lead to criminal behaviors later in life, correct?
Correct.
And I believe your direct examination testimony was about 50% more likely, correct?
Correct. Yep.
And the antisocial behaviors in adulthood that can result from adverse childhood experiences can include homicidal tendencies, correct?
Correct. It's very rare, but correct.
You also said what was very rare was for someone to experience 8 or more adverse childhood experiences, right?
Correct.
You were not assigned to this case by the court, but hired by the defense, correct?
Correct.
And you were retained by the defense in this matter about a year ago?
Correct. I wanted to, correct, about that time.
And fair to say that you have spent dozens and dozens of hours working on the matter?
Correct.
You spoke multiple times with defense counsel.
Correct.
You prepared a written report reviewing professional literature.
Correct.
You gave testimony at a deposition.
Correct.
And you are giving testimony here today, right?
Correct.
How many of those dozens of hours of work that you have performed in the case have been devoted to assessing and treating the defendant being sentenced here today?
I would say that like 0.
You've never met him
I did-
before,
I-
right?
I do want, oh, sorry, I wasn't done.
I think
Yeah,
you
please-
answered my
please,
question, Doctor.
Did you want to complete your answer, Doctor?
I did, yeah, thank you. I did want to make clear that I did find out about the defendant in some of the portions of the events of the case when I met with counsel this past Wednesday.
Well, Judge,
And then I
actually,
did listen
I would
to
object, and if we
the
need to
earlier,
approach, I'd approach right now.
Okay, I think right now she just said that she has had discussions with counsel. Is there going to be, I take it that none of this new information has been disclosed to the state?
There's
I-
no
information-
I'm just worried that she's about to offer opinions about those discussions that have not been disclosed. So that doesn't sound like that's the case. So yes,
No.
I think the state's objecting to you going beyond what has been disclosed to the state prior to today's hearing, and doesn't sound like there's an effort from defense counsel to go there, so I'm going to ask you, Doctor, not to get into things that have not previously been disclosed. Thank you.
Of course, yes.
You've never met the defendant in this case before, right?
No, I have not.
You've never spoken to the defendant in this case before, right?
No, I have not.
Have you ever even laid eyes on him before the hearing today?
I have not.
Moving forward, how many additional hours of your professional experience will you spend devoted to assessing and treating him and the various significant poor outcomes that can result from his adverse childhood experiences?
I would not be treating him.
Who will?
You would have to ask the defense.
No further questions.
Any further direct examination?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate your patience with me with the technology.
No, it was our struggle with the technology in this courtroom that led to a little bit of delay, but I think we're back on track. As the defense ready to call the next witness?
I believe so.
We are. Defense calls Dr. Lori Guidry.
Good afternoon, Doctor. If I can have you raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you're to give in this proceeding is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under the pains and penalties of perjury? You would have a seat and state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
My name is Laurie Guidry, Laurie. Guidry is Guidry.
And I think I heard counsel talking about a stipulation. Dr. Guidry has testified in front of me in prior matters. I know she's a qualified psychologist. don't know if you want to go beyond there to qualify her in any other specific areas, but certainly she has opined in this court on at least one occasion, probably more, but I know I've seen her reports in other matters as well.
You are correct. I think you heard us correctly, Judge, and I am stipulating for the record.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman Friesen.
Dr. Guidry, we retained you to evaluate Eric Sweeney in this case, is that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And have you reviewed his records?
Yes,
Okay. Did you review DCYF records?
I did.
Did you review counseling records?
Yes,
Did you review the discovery in this case?
yes,
Have you met with Eric?
yes,
Have you received other sources of information from other collateral sources?
yes,
And you wrote 2 reports in this case?
I did, Your Honor. Yep.
And so I'm trying to, in the interest of time, to be brief and be efficient. So I don't know how well you could hear from the back of the courtroom, but we talked with Dr. Oyen about ACEs.
Yes.
And you're
I
familiar
I
with
couldn't
ACEs.
hear too well, but I caught a bit.
And you've reviewed Dr. Oyen's report, I believe.
I have.
And so, just quickly, to go through the ACEs, I'd like you to just tell me if, in your opinion, Eric experienced each one of those. Emotional abuse,
After the records I reviewed were quite extensive, and so, yes, I did see that, evidence of that.
physical abuse,
Yes,
sexual abuse,
yes,
seeing a mother treated violently,
yes,
substance abuse in the household,
yes,
mental illness in the household,
yes,
parental separation or divorce,
yes,
incarcerated household member,
yes,
emotional neglect,
yes,
physical neglect.
yes.
We heard Dr. Oyen explain a lot about how ACEs can affect a child's developing brain. How is it different to have repeated instances of neglect and abuse as opposed to, say, having one solitary thing happen?
Well, having an isolated episode gives us a better chance to respond and use our resources and have some level of resiliency in response. I think when we look at this case, we're looking at trauma, negative effects from in utero. So there was early exposure to substances in utero. Also early exposure, Your Honor, to the mother's likely disrupted autonomic nervous system, which gets internalized. Upon entering the world, he is also then experiencing all the things we just spoke about, neglect and those things that don't allow a child who's evolving to feel safe. And that's when the brain is getting wired up. And so there's the experience, the building sort of mindset, schema around threat and perceiving threat in your environment. And that's what happened, as I can see it.
Did Eric have any historical mental health diagnoses for what you saw in the records?
He had a number of diagnoses, and I think this reflects both his trajectory as well as the difficulty in diagnosing children, youth, and adolescents, because things are changing, they're growing, and a lot of things are happening at the same time. So he had a number of diagnoses, everything from PTSD, ADHD, some evidence of bipolar disorder, conduct disorder, those kinds of diagnoses along the way when people were trying very hard to figure out what was happening to him.
So can you talk about the maturity of adolescents and 16-year-olds generally, like sort of a baseline?
Certainly, I think that as Dr. Oyen talked about, we have a lot of research now that tells us more about adolescent development and what we should expect with regards to the process and the end process and how much longer it takes for a person to come into a fully mature brain than we knew before. And we may not all remember, but it's a pretty hard developmental stage. There's a lot of things that are happening, flood of hormones, growth, new cues in the environment, proneness to impulsivity, as Dr. Oyen talked about, thinking about consequences, judgment, all those kinds of things are online or getting online. And if you don't have the base, which we go back to that beginning, his very early experiences in the environment and in his life, birth to 6, you don't have a foundation. There's one thing to talk about the normal adolescent issues that we face. It's another thing to go into that and be compromised from the start.
Is it your belief that at 16 was Eric a typical adolescent, a 16-year-old? Or was he more mature, less mature?
I'd say when we're talking about this whole element of socio-emotional maturity, again, given the early experiences he had where he was deprived from stimulus and food and support and safety early on, and developed this maladaptive schema of fear and survival and threat perception in the world, that he did not move into that with a lot of maturity, because he was always, I think he even quoted someone in the record who said he was always catching up. He was always trying to catch up with his peers, and that he was behind in his socio-emotional development because of these early attachment disruptions that happened, which just did not allow him to figure out how to connect safely to anybody.
Can you talk about how Eric's history might have impacted the way he responded to perceived threats?
Well, this goes back to the very, very, very early wiring of the brain with regards to threat perception. And as he moves into his environment and it's not safe and he can't find a way, he begins to develop maladaptive behaviors, but he also begins to develop a maladaptive worldview. The world is not safe. I cannot be safe. I need to do things to manage. So he began to develop, maladaptive behaviors like stealing and stealing for food, and he was hungry all the time, and homeless, and all those kinds of things were happening to him. So as he moves into the world and his brain begins to say, what is the world and where am I and how safe is it? He's not building the capacity to know that he's safe. And as he moves through this, it becomes very resistant to changing. And so there's the perception, as Dr. Oyen was talking about, there's a threat that's real. When we first started talking about trauma and the fight-flight response, it was like the saber-toothed tiger is coming and we're going to run. As we evolved into our current culture, there are many more ambiguous threats in our culture, so we perceive them. They may or may not be real, but we perceive them and we react. What's happened with Eric is that over this extended period of time is that his perceptions become distorted, so that anything that begins holding this maladaptive schema, anything that even moves in the direction of his perception of threat, he'll react to, because it becomes a misperception of threat. And it can be an innocuous event, it can be something that we wouldn't even recognize in our lives as a threat, but for him, everything is dangerous.
Can you, you referred a little bit to his history of taking food. Can you talk about his history of hoarding food and why you believe he did this?
Again, we go back to the beginning. This is where everything begins, and food is primary to our lives. And when you are a young child and you are hungry and not fed consistently, appropriately, you will search for, it's called food scarcity, you'll search for ways of getting food. And one of the things I think this demonstrates, Your Honor, is that even as he was in circumstances where he had enough food, these times and spaces where he had enough, he still responded the same way, because he was still perceiving the threat, the possible loss of food in that source the same way. And that really informs of the other ways in which that persisted in spite of well-intentioned love and care. By that time, it was too late. He's wired that way, and the interventions weren't able to carry him past a different mindset.
Why do you believe Eric had difficulties with obeying house rules and adjusting when he moved in with Sean and Cassandra?
Again, I'll say that I think the early attachment disruption, the chronic pervasive cycle of rejection and neglect, and then so-and-chum affection and inconsistency really contributes. It's like our most powerful reinforcement schedule is intermittent reinforcement, and that mindset that he had was intermittently reinforced, so it became quite fixed. And so when he moves into an environment, as I said, his misperception of threat was one thing that led him astray, but the other piece is that looking at it from the outside, the behaviors that he had adopted to survive were now problematic in a healthy setting. So we know children need structure and support and supervision and consistency. That was not there. And once he got it, he didn't know how to live in that kind of a space because he was, again, perceiving many of the things that were happening to him as threats.
I'd like to ask you about your theories about Eric's psychological response to the deaths of Cassandra Benjamin and Mason Sweeney. Do you have any theories about how his brain responded to their deaths?
Well, again, we start at the beginning and look at that evolution of his threat perception and the distortion of it as he goes along in even minor or more serious even threats to his safety that emerged. And I think that one of the things I'm aware of and has some experience assessing is looking at individuals who have committed significant crimes, having a traumatic stress response to the crime that they committed. And what can happen in those kinds of episodes, and as I've assessed before, is that the individual can have such a strong traumatic response that they do not encode the memory of it. So we often don't encode the memory of our trauma. Just in general, if someone's having a PTSD experience, part of the symptoms can be that you're not encoding it because it bypasses your executive function, goes straight into the body, and it doesn't get encoded. The same kind of thing can happen when you are committing an awful crime, and there can be an inability to recall it because it didn't get encoded in the first place. So that's as I worked through the case with Eric and looked at the records and tried to put this very complicated history, extensive history of trauma together, and looked at the different options for diagnoses, this appeared to me, Your Honor, to be the most parsimonious and fully capturing of the dynamics that I was seeing.
Do you believe that Eric is a psychopath?
I did look through that lens at Eric, but I did not see the data or the behaviors to suggest that he is. There are features of psychopathy in youth, being egocentric and unemotional or things like that that are consistent across other youth, but it's the constellation that we're looking for. And what I would say is that, we all have defense mechanisms. They're designed, they're unconscious, even though they don't look like they're unconscious, they look intentional, but they're designed to protect us from the way we would feel about something awful that we've done. We all have them. In an extreme case like this, what we see is a defensive response to not being able to tolerate the emotion, the effects of the actions that are taken. And in that space and in the context of the crime, I do believe that Eric did not encode this information in this particular context, remembering that he's already wired for cutting off his emotions and kind of managing them, but holding them at bay and then breaking through. So he has a capacity to shut down. In this capacity, he did it even more so.
You met with Eric first at the Sununu Center, the Youth Detention Center, and then you also met with him later at the jail.
I
Is that
did.
correct? Okay. And how was he different or similar, or was he different?
I'd say that when I first met Eric, he was more anxious. There was more signs of his anxiety, biting his nails and picking at his fingers. He was more distracted, difficult to engage, not really very responsive, somewhat monosyllabic in his responses, and difficult to engage in wanting to escape what he was experiencing as an anxiety-provoking, threatening environment as quick as he could. As I saw him later, some maturation had occurred. He was calmer, he was less distracted, was not picking at himself, and had matured, had grown physically as well as to a degree somewhat emotionally.
Do you believe that Eric has the capacity to change?
Well, I'm a psychologist, so I believe in the capacity for people to change. And I think when we think about these early effects and the duration in this particular case, that the capacity to change is there. We'll take treatment, intensive treatment. I know from experience that I've had very recently working with lifetime parole cases, since the adolescent brain science Your Honor, has come into play, has changed some of the sentencing. And assessing these gentlemen who had engaged in murder and difficult crimes like that early in their lives, I've been able to observe that there is this capacity to change in the right rehabilitative environment over time.
And those gentlemen that you're talking about, were they receiving constant therapy every day?
Not constant therapy every day, but they were in justice resource kinds of programming and therapy. They were working on goals and employed in the setting. So there were a lot of things that were happening in the setting itself where there was, again, structure and consistency and accountability that was consistent, in addition to the work they took on with regards to things like restorative justice.
And these gentlemen, they were all in prison, correct?
Yes.
Let me have a moment. Anything else? I have nothing further.
Attorney Hinkle.
With your respect to your belief for capacity for change, that's based on anecdotal stories, right? Your own experiences?
They're based on my professional experiences of change, yeah.
Do you have any professional studies that talk about that and
The
actual
efficacy
results?
of treatment?
Yeah.
Yes, there are many studies talking about the efficacy of treatment. It's a little bit hard to determine because of the nature of doing efficacy studies, but treatment can have a positive effect on people's outcomes.
And it may not.
Correct.
With respect to treatment, you've outlined the various work that you've conducted in this case, right?
Yes,
And your role in this case has been limited to assessment, not treatment, right?
correct.
Basically, you don't do treatment, right?
In my life,
No,
in my professional practice, I do treatment.
So go into your, you got your deposition with you by chance?
I do not.
Counsel 35. Judge, can I approach?
Of course.
I'm going to read the question, and then I'll read your whole answer and make sure that I'm correct.
Yep.
Question, so how many patients do you generally see or have under your care? Answer, so I don't do treatment. I do primarily assessment. I do some very limited treatment with some higher kind of more complicated folks in my service that I do at the forensic hospital down in Concord.
Right.
I read that correctly.
Yes, you did.
With respect to your assessment of Mr. Sweeney, the defendant, you went over with the court instances in which he was victimized and suffered trauma, correct?
Yes,
You're also aware that the defendant engaged in victimization prior to the charged crimes here, right?
yes, I'm aware of that.
And Judge, for reference, this
I-
is
Yeah.
paragraph 91 of
Paragraph 91, yes. Okay, 1 second.
the defense sentencing memorandum.
Yes.
And you're aware that the defendant was placed on probation as a result of his own acts of victimization, right?
Yes, I am.
And only a few months after the defendant's probation for his own prior victimization ended, he committed a triple homicide.
Correct.
Months, right?
Yes.
With respect to your assessment of the defendant, you determined that he exhibited features of antisocial personality disorder, right?
Yes, I did.
And at the time of your assessments, he was too young to diagnose with antisocial personality disorder, which cannot be diagnosed before the age of 18, right?
Correct.
But he clearly exhibited features consistent with antisocial personality disorder later in life, right?
Yes, he did.
And to be clear, antisocial personality disorder is not psychopathy, right?
It's not psychopathy, and neither are features of antisocial personality disorder.
And among the features that he exhibited pursuant to your assessment was conduct disorder,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
Engaging in illegality, right?
yes,
At times difficult to manage, right?
yes,
At times, he engaged in episodes of aggression outside the murders that he committed, right?
Yes.
And at times, he engaged in episodes of violence outside of the murders that he committed,
Yes.
right? The defendant exhibits character pathology, right?
Exhibits features of it, yes.
An antisocial personality disorder is a personality disorder, right?
Yes.
It has an onset in adolescence or early adulthood and is stable over time, right?
Yes.
It's an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior, right?
Correct.
And it's experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture, right?
Yes.
And it's pervasive and inflexible, right?
Yes.
And it can lead to distress or impairment, right?
Correct.
And antisocial personality disorder involves a pattern of disregard for or violation of the rights of others, right?
Correct.
Sitting here today, you cannot make any determination whether and to what extent this particular defendant will mature and rehabilitate over time, can you?
I can make no specific discernments about that. I mean, I think when I look at the information we have now, which I think was missing with his extensive efforts at treatment, there's more information now to understand how we might address his needs.
The past experience is that when probation ended for his prior victimization, his behavior worsened, and he ultimately murdered 3 people, right? That's the historical fact, what we know of the defendant, Mr.
That's correct.
Sweeney. As part of the assessment that you were hired to conduct, you spoke to the defendant about the crimes with which he was charged, right?
I did.
And he denied to you that he committed the murders, right?
He told me that he could not remember elements of it, but yes, he did deny committing the offenses.
And the defendant did not tell you that he could not remember what happened, right?
He told me what did happen, but there were spaces in which he did not recall.
Okay, so let's go back to your deposition. Page 67, counsel? I'm sorry, Judge.
Oh, yeah, no, you, council can freely approach, I should. So-
Line 5. Question, at any point, did he tell you he couldn't remember what happened? Answer, no.
That's correct. You're right. I misspoke. It's not that he didn't remember. His account of the story was not consistent with what the facts of the case.
Well, we will get to that. What he claimed to you was that he did not commit the murders,
Yes.
right?
Correct.
And he relayed to you that it made him feel mad and hurt his feelings that anyone would think that he committed the murders, right?
That's correct.
And not only did Mr. Sweeney, the defendant, deny to you committing the murders, he provided you with an account of what he was doing when he claimed somebody else was committing the murders, right?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
He provided you with details in support of his claim of innocence to you, right?
Yes.
For example, he claimed to you that he was downstairs in the basement when he heard gunshots upstairs, right?
Yes, he did.
And he claimed to you that he felt frightened when he heard the gunshots upstairs while he was in the basement.
That's correct.
And he further claimed to you that ultimately he went upstairs and he discovered the victims' bodies, right?
That's correct.
And he further claimed to you that after discovering the bodies, he returned to the basement and hid for a while because he claimed he was frightened.
Correct.
Right? And that's what the defendant claimed to you during your assessment of him, right?
Yes.
No further questions.
Further direct examination?
Briefly. Dr. Guidry, do you believe that Eric does have antisocial personality disorder?
I don't.
Why not?
I believe that, as I mentioned before, Your Honor, that the diagnosis of PTSD better explains his issues.
think you wrote one.
And to add, there's antisocial behavior, and then there's a pattern, a long-standing pattern. And what I have observed in the records with Eric, both is that he has these behaviors that we've talked about before, are emerged from the perception of threat, that are illegal, that are stealing and things like that. But he has also demonstrated at different times the capacity to care about others, to engage in treatment, to desire to be liked, and has not every moment of his life has been antisocial. Those features to me are more representative of this early impact on his life and the way he learned to navigate the world. So there's behaviors, and I see more behaviors than I do see that as character pathology in a persistent way.
And do you have any idea why he might be untruthful about what happened with the murders?
Well, we go back to, in his testing for PTSD, one of the more elevated scales was defensive avoidance. And so this is sort of defending against anything that would indicate that you've done something bad or you've done something wrong, which, as I pointed out before, we all do that to kind of try and minimize it. We've made a mistake or done something bad, but at this level of extreme behavior, I believe that there's a part of his clinical picture includes this defensive avoidance pattern where he's cut himself off from taking responsibility for it because he can't, he's a fragile ego structure based on these earlier experiences. And we defend because we can't tolerate the negative feelings, the grief, the rage, all those things. And so that's why a person would be defended against the response the way Eric has been.
Have you, in your experience speaking with people who have committed murder, have you seen this before, that people do not remember or incorrectly remember the crimes with which they are charged? Or
Yes, I
been
have
convicted?
seen before, yes.
And do they ever later come to acknowledge what it is that they've done?
Some, not all, but some have, and it's often been seen where an individual, over time and maturation and some level of recovery, and when they can establish the capacities to tolerate what they've done, may get some recollection of the memory.
Thank you.
Any further cross-examination?
No, thank you, Judge.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. You're excused. Additional witnesses for the defense?
Yes, so Attorney Taggart-Hampton is going to speak about some legal
Okay,
issues.
absolutely. Did you want to
Take
take?
a
Do you want to
break?
take? Yeah, maybe we should take about a 5 or 10 minute break. I know it's impossible to do a 5-minute break. So we'll shoot for a 10-minute break, then we'll resume at about 2:10. Thank you.
All right.